Welcome, everyone. My name is Angela Brown. This course is titled Unincorporated Histories, Puerto Rican Art Then and Now. It's a two-part course, and this first part is titled Views from Sky and Land. I'll get right into it, and I'll leave time at the end for questions. In this film still from Sofia Gaisa Moriente's B-roll, we see a man looking out the window of a helicopter. He's looking over Puerto Rico, surveying the land, likely in order to choose some plot of property on which to develop. The video is taken from video produced for the Puerto Rico Tourism Company and Department of Economic Development and Commerce, so it's found footage. And the audio, Gaisa Moriente took field recordings at the 2016 Summit for Puerto Rico Investment. And so as this film unrolls, you have this secondary footage, the B-roll of these tourism promotional videos. And then you have audio of these real estate developers, often US entrepreneurs, who are describing why they are investing in Puerto Rico, why they are developing in Puerto Rico, the tax breaks that they get, their surprise at ways of life in Puerto Rico, often very othering language. Gaisa Moriente notes the importance of the drone shot in a lot of this promotional tourist imagery. In other words, this aerial view, right, where this view from above, seeing an island splayed out, many islands splayed out, becomes a marketing tool. And I'd like to start this talk by asking why that aerial view is a marketing tool, especially for real estate development and tourism. For one thing, there's the privilege of the aerial view, right? You're above. It's sort of a bird's eye or even a God's eye view. It makes you feel like you're in control. And then there's, of course, the privilege of being in a helicopter. This man in his suit and tie and his sunglasses doesn't have to sit in traffic, right? He can fly across the island, jump from the main island of Puerto Rico to Vieques easily. And in that way, he feels immune from the kind of infrastructural issues that affect most locals and most people who are on the actual ground. This talk as a whole will draw connections between works on view in the current exhibition, No Existe, Mundo, poshuracán, Puerto Rican Art in the Wake of Hurricane Maria. And that work is from the past 5 years. And it'll pair that work and draw connections between that work and films, posters, and paintings from a broader arc of Puerto Rican art and art history and regular history. I'll begin our look into the past with a poster. This poster here is by Julio Rosado del Valle, and he made it for a film directed by the photographer Jack Delano. In this film, we see Puerto Rico from above, another aerial view, this time from an airplane. The film was produced as a part of an initiative called DIVEDCO, the Division for Community Education. This initiative was under a broader umbrella, which was called Operation Bootstrap or Operación Manos a la Obra. And this was put in place or initiated by the US government right after the declaration of Puerto Rico as a so-called Estado Libre Asociado, a free associated state. And that is still the status of Puerto Rico with regards to the United States today. And so this Division for Community Education sought to sort of create a shared cultural narrative for Puerto Ricans, both on the coasts and in the cities and in the rural and mountainous interior. And this film in particular wanted to show the range of landscapes and in particular the range of natural resources available in Puerto Rico, and to show it, of course, from above. The title Desde las Nubes, meaning from the clouds. Julio Rosado del Valle actually became quite well known as an abstract expressionist or lyrical abstract painter. And this gained him some international recognition in the post-war period, especially because his work started to gear towards that abstraction and therefore leave behind a lot of the more explicitly political content contained in some of the social realist work coming out of Puerto Rico in these years. Jack Delano, who directed that film Desde las Nubes, was in Puerto Rico as a part of the Farm Security Administration. So this US initiative, this time he's photographing Puerto Rico in order to survey, again, this range of experiences, especially in terms of agriculture. And so Delano becomes quite well known for these portraits and these scenes of Puerto Rico in the 30s and 40s. And I'm showing you here first a still on the left, and this is a still from that film Desde las Nubes. And in this scene, it's quite blurry because it's an old film, but in this scene, what we have is a man who has a map of the main island of Puerto Rico. And on that map, he's marking out the location of various resources. So the two circles you see on both the west and then the northeast, those both say madera, so wood. And then the X's, the key tells us at the top, are minerals. And so this man who we see earlier in the film is in that airplane, right, looking down from above, surveying the land, is now looking again at a different kind of aerial view, that is the map. And we can zoom even further back in thinking about this privileged position of the aerial view if we think of maps themselves. The expansion of empire often coincides or involves at least the creation of maps, the fine-tuning of maps, and the idea that land is property, right? That the more land you find, the more land you're able to extract resources from, right? So the map allows the colonizer to see what resources they're able to extract and to map those. Other parts of the film also show the locations of fields of sugar and of coffee. And there are already at this point in 1949 scenes which describe the degradation of the soil in Puerto Rico. And this being a result of over farming, especially with monocultures, that is, the continuous growth of sugar or tobacco on soil without leaving enough time for that soil to become healthy again, fertile again. I show you this still here because it's an aerial view that shows the way that the tourists or the real estate developers' perception of Puerto Rico as this land on which to buy property, on which to expand one's ownership of paradise even, goes back quite far. And that operation that I mentioned, Operation Bootstrap, or in Spanish, Operación Manos a la Obra, the Spanish title there translates loosely to "Let's get to work." And so this is an initiative from the US government encouraging Puerto Ricans to get to work. This is, for many, a sort of era of hope. There's a real surge in artistic production in the early 1950s in Puerto Rico, because there was a kind of hope that this new status as Estado Libre Asociado would bring Puerto Ricans more rights, perhaps even more sovereignty, and more of a voice, sort of compared to its previous status as a military territory of the United States. However, we'll see that the differences there and this kind of promises associated with the status of Estado Libre Asociado are quite difficult to pin down and are often purposefully in a sort of gray area with much control still held by the United States government. So this idea of getting to work and of sort of inciting an excitement around moving away from a kind of agricultural economy towards an industrial economy. So with Operation Bootstrap, we had the development of textile factories in and outside of San Juan, the capital of Puerto Rico. And we have these mass migrations from the rural interior, the mountainous interior, to those industrial plants, right? And so these images by Delano are showing moments that become few and farther in between. This woman here, who's a coffee picker on a farm near Corozal, and she has a basket tied to her waist. And Delano became quite well known for these portraits. So to consider a connection between land, that sort of aerial view, and land as property, and histories of labor in Puerto Rico, I'll take us all the way back to the 19th century, when Puerto Rico was a Spanish colony. And here we have a painting by Francisco Oller titled Hacienda La Fortuna. This is from 1885, and it was commissioned by a man named Jose Gallar Borges. And this was a Spanish man based in Barcelona who had 5 sugar mills and land on which to grow sugar, and made a lot of money off of this. He commissioned Oller to paint his sugar mills so that he could hang these paintings in his home in Barcelona. So the painting of the agricultural landscape with these new advances in agricultural technology. You see the mill, the steam-powered mill on the right. These paintings served for this landowner as these kinds of bragging tools, right? He could hang them in his house all the way in Barcelona, and he could show everyone that he had this property afar across the ocean, right? Oller actually didn't finish the other 4 paintings. He only did this one. And it's worth asking, if his priorities shifted. Oller was an abolitionist, and in fact, there's a missing painting of Oller's that's an abolitionist painting depicting an enslaved man who is being beaten. And this painting only exists in these kinds of blurry photographs, while Oller's paintings of landscapes with workers, small and almost blending into that landscape, and his other genre scenes, those become sort of part of the history books, right? So it's worth asking how these artists become sort of canonized, right? And with what works they are. Certainly, it's much easier to fit Oller into a kind of Eurocentric art historical arc if you say that he trained in France, which he did, and he learned the painting techniques associated with Impressionism, a loose brushstroke, atmospheric effects, as well as realism. But then, that's where he slides in, that he's this sort of Puerto Rican impressionist. But of course, there's much more behind that. Slavery was abolished in Puerto Rico in 1873, but the hacienda system continued to exploit laborers for the profits of foreign investors. Puerto Rico is consistently pictured for others, from Spanish landowners to US tourists and real estate developers, like the one in Gaisa Moriente's B-roll in his helicopter. Here, Garvin Sierra Vega makes this consumption, even this gluttony over property, quite explicit in this work here. Sierra Vega serves steak to Natalie Ann Jaresco, or Jaresco, and Natalie Ann Jaresco was appointed in 2017 as the executive director of the Financial Oversight and Management Board for Puerto Rico, colloquially known as La Junta. La Junta was installed in 2015 by the US government after the announcement of a so-called unpayable debt that Puerto Rico owed to the United States and others. And so this board was appointed and has the power to enforce certain laws, such as prohibiting civil employees from from protesting, restructuring the economy in various ways, and this board has been really criticized, not only for being made up of people in the investment world who have no connection to Puerto Rico whatsoever, perhaps who have only visited once or twice to play golf or to go on vacation, and perhaps more insidiously, that a lot of those members or some of the members of the board seem to have conflicts of interest. That is their own involvement in the investment and banking worlds has connections to the production of this so-called unpayable debt. And so it was in 2019, I believe, that several US Congress members and other representatives signed a letter demanding that La Junta, this board, disclose these conflicts of interest. So Sierra Vega cooks his steak and suggests that Natalie Ann Jaresco, this leader of the board, sees Puerto Rico from above, right? It's an image of Puerto Rico like a map, and she can consume it, right? That the board is made up of people who are thinking about Puerto Rico as something to be carved, something to be consumed without consideration for what the people want or need. So to shift away from aerial views, I'm now going to look at a few views from the land, so from the bottom up rather from the top down, and specifically the land as a site of protest and reclamation. This here is a print by Lorenzo Homar, who was a master printmaker, and here we see that he's created a portrait of Pedro Albizu Campos, and behind that portrait we have quotations by Albizu Campos. One of them at the bottom here reads in part, "Puerto Rico has the right to its independence because when the Agreement of Paris was signed," this is after the Spanish-American War, which transferred Puerto Rico to Spain, or transferred Puerto Rico from Spain to the US. When the Agreement of Paris was signed, by which the United States took possession of the island, Puerto Rico had already enjoyed international recognition of its sovereignty. Therefore, Spain did not have the right to acquire it, and the US did not have the right Spain did not have the right to give it, and the US did not have the right to acquire it. And this is in 1930. So Albizu Campos is thinking about the land itself as something that's been passed between colonial hands. And this is quite important. However, statements like this and nationalist or independentista sentiments in general had deadly consequences, especially in the 1930s. And this painting, which is included in No Existe, references one such incident explicitly. This is a painting by Daniel de Jesus, and it's titled Google the Ponce Massacre. Its title is therefore a command. It tells us to do something, to look into a history. The background of this painting in black and white is de Jesus's interpretation of an archival photograph from the Ponce Massacre of 1937. This event took place after a group of protesters who had a permit to be on the streets of Ponce, a city on the south coast of the main island of Puerto Rico. And these protesters gathered for two reasons. One, to speak up against the unfair incarceration of Albizu Campos, who was the leader of the Nationalist Party at the time and was imprisoned by the US military government. So this is before the status as Estado Libre Asociado, was imprisoned by the US military government under so-called sedition charges. And so the protesters gathered in order to draw attention to this unfair incarceration and to celebrate the abolition of slavery. And so this was a sanctioned taking up of public space. However, the US military governor at the time ordered armed police officers to open fire on the crowd. 19 civilians and 3 policemen were killed, and many of them were shot in the back, so they were fleeing, right? And so we have here this this interpretation by De Jesus of this photograph of some of the victims, and over it we have a more recent memory or view. De Jesus gives us 2 figures, a police officer in blue on the left, and then De Jesus's friend on the right, who's wearing a handkerchief over the bottom half of their face. This was a scene that De Jesus experienced in Union Square in 2019. There was a protest held in Union Square in solidarity with the protests going on at the same time in Puerto Rico to oust the then governor, Ricky Rosselló, whose corruption and gross neglect and disrespect towards the people of Puerto Rico finally reached a head, and the people successfully ousted him after protesting in the streets. But of course, you know, the Puerto Ricans of the diaspora and others in support of this protest gathered elsewhere. And that's what was happening here, where De Jesus and her friend are in Union Square in solidarity with that protest. But her friend had this confrontation with a police officer. And there was this real fear that that confrontation would become increasingly violent. They were left feeling shaken, of course. And this is when De Jesus said, Google the Ponce Massacre, encouraging her friend to, like her, start to draw these connections in this longer history, right, from the 1930s to the present, of militarized police officers being sent to quell peaceful protests. Well, I include De Jesus's painting in this part of the course because I want to show this ongoing relationship between reclaiming land and space and protecting human rights. Puerto Rican art and protest will become more of a central theme in the second part of the course. But for now, I want to focus on that idea of reclaiming space, taking up civic space, public space, and land itself. Another 2 paintings in the show, Armig Santos's Yellow Flowers here, and Procession in Vieques 3 here, Procession in Vieques, show an event from 1999 that was precipitated by the death of a man named David Santos Rodriguez on the island of Vieques. Vieques is a smaller island off the northeast coast of the main island of Puerto Rico. And for over 60 years, Vieques was occupied by the US Navy, and over 2/3 of the island were used for testing various drills, for testing dropping of bombs, for landmines. And of course, you might imagine that there's consequences to this, right? Chemical runoff, zones of danger. And so the people of Vieques, you know, lived in a state of explosion, of being squeezed in between these dangerous moments. And in the case of Santos Rodriguez, that became deadly. He was a civilian employee of the Navy at this time, and he was at his post when 2 practice bombs landed near his post, and they were not supposed to be landing there. This was a mistake, and from a sort of lack of confirmation around where those bombs were to be dropped. And Santos Rodriguez was killed by those bombs. This caused real outrage as well as sadness, of course, among the people of Vieques and of Puerto Rico in general. And so these 2 paintings by Santos show us a procession where Santos Rodriguez becomes a sort of martyr to the land of Vieques. And this procession here, we have people carrying a cross, and that cross would be installed at the top of a decommissioned US tank as this way of remembering Santos Rodriguez, turning him into a sort of martyr. And interestingly, reclaiming a Christian symbol as instead a symbol of protest and remembrance and anti-colonial struggle. So it's interesting to see in this grand scope, right? If we're going all the way back to the 16th century and the colonization of the Americas, then Christianity was one of the first tools of this colonization. And so we have here this this moment where the cross is transformed instead into an anti-colonial symbol. Rogelio Baez Vega asks us to consider not occupied land, but abandoned land. Here we have the Escuela Tomás Carrión Maduro. And this is a school that the artist himself attended, but that we see here abandoned. As a part of the installment of that board in 2015, La Junta, many austerity measures were put in place in Puerto Rico. And a main one was basically a disinvestment in the public school system. So many schools closed. And so you get these images like these moments where the school becomes a ruin, an abandoned space. And Baez Vega shows us the weeds that are growing in the yard, the ways that the walls have, become dirty, and the tree even is barren, right? Giving it this sense of quiet, of desolation. However, as we see in the title, New on the Market, this building, like many other buildings like it, was put on the market in order to be sold to private investors. And so, real estate developers could buy this building, a beautiful one, and turn it into a luxury resort, a private home. And so this history, one's memory of going to school, right? The way that a school becomes an anchor in a community, right? Instead becomes privatized, and the people no longer have access to it. The name of the school, Tomás Carrión Maduro, pays homage to an early 20th century Afro-Puerto Rican journalist. And so there's another layer there where the naming of places gets stripped away when it goes into private hands. And so those children who walked into this school every day and learned about this journalist as a historical figure, there will be no more generations of students passing through that doorway, right? And this is significant. As children pass through schools, right, they develop connections to one another. Community networks are formed that allow for solidarity to form, allow for collaboration. And so this idea of the school closing, as Baez Vega points out, represents a real failure on the part of the government. So what do we lose when a local school closes? Like I said, generational connections to place, as well as place-based knowledge. So that connection to land, right, means that you're learning the names of the plants of the land, you're learning the names of the streets, the historical figures that those streets are named after. But if there's a lack of investment in things like public education, if there aren't enough jobs, right, more and more waves of Puerto Ricans on the archipelago end up immigrating by necessity, and therefore creating these breaks in that generational knowledge and in that knowledge attached to place. I'm showing you here another painting by Francisco Oller, and here this is the school of Master Rafael Cordero from around 1890. Rafael Cordero was a self-educated man who provided free schooling to children in San Juan, and is known as the so-called father of public education. He believed that education could provide upward mobility to children of different classes, races, and backgrounds. And we see him here with all of these children, and on the wall, these Christian symbols, right? So a connection there with Armig Santos's paintings, where that colonial force or tool of Christianity then still makes its way into these efforts that at a larger scale are anti-colonial efforts to allow the people to rise up to make the changes that they feel are necessary. So a suggestion, the reclamation of land paired with the reclamation of education might create the tools or community networks needed for Puerto Ricans to take back control of their own natural resources. So that map from the Delano film showing all of those things to be extracted, right? Those continue to be extracted in various ways. And the scale of that extraction now happens at, at an economic level that is even more complicated. And so, there's a straight line between those aerial views of sugar fields and recent calls to pursue food sovereignty in Puerto Rico. And I'll focus on that for this part of the talk. This is a painting here by Gamaliel Rodriguez, and it depicts the sinking of a cargo ship called El Faro in 2015. This ship was leaving from the US en route to Puerto Rico, and it was carrying basic materials, foodstuffs, bread, lettuce, things that were necessary. There was a Hurricane Joaquin, I believe, and it caused this ship, El Faro, to sink off the coast of the Bahamas, therefore not getting those resources to Puerto Rico. This event brought a lot of awareness around restrictions that are still in place that were initiated by the US government. One in particular is the Jones Act of 1920. And that act requires that any ship docking in Puerto Rico be made in the US and have a US crew. And so when this ship here sinks or sank, other neighboring Caribbean nations, other places in Latin America who wanted to go and fill in the gap, even make a profit, were unable to provide that aid to Puerto Rico. And so it raised a lot of questions around this dependency on the United States and where that really comes from, given that there is plenty of fertile land in Puerto Rico, right, where the food could come from. Instead, you go to supermarkets and much of that food comes from elsewhere. And the prices are higher and higher each day. And so this dependency is in fact increases, it seems, as time goes on. This is a painting from 1905, El Pan Nuestro, our daily bread, it's usually translated as. And this is quite a famous painting in Puerto Rican art history. And it shows a man holding a bunch of plantains, plátanos, and he's walking on this path here through the mountains. And he has this daily bread, right? Another Christian reference of not only a food that nourishes you physically, but with the implication of a sort of spiritual nourishment. But he's not holding bread, he's holding plantains. And so he represents this connection specifically to Puerto Rican soil. And he follows the kind of codes associated with depictions of the jibaro, which is the Puerto Rican symbol of the kind of campesino, representing this connection to the land. And this connection to the land, many in the coasts and of course in the diaspora, have lost in many ways, right? So the figure of the jibaro becomes a nostalgic figure. He's often whitewashed and becomes sort of folklorized as this kind of noble, a noble figure who has this connection to the land. Yet the plátano itself continues to link Caribbean peoples in a manner that threatens the control of European colonial power. And there's a great photograph here by Miguel Luciano titled Plátano Pride from 2006. And here we have a young child who has this huge plantain as a chain, on a chain around his neck. And so, this is disconnected, of course, from the agriculture itself, from the soil itself, but instead references this wider network of symbols, right, where agriculture becomes a symbol in the diaspora, so that if you're in New York, if you're in Chicago, to make a dish with plantains, right, is to continue in this connection to land. And so that continuation of traditions via food is a way of sort of allowing for this connection to the land perhaps to continue. In this work, also in the exhibition by Gabriela Salazar, we have a depiction of coffee drying racks. And in this case, they are made out of wood. They're on a sort of deck outside, right outside of the exhibition. And they function almost as they would in real life, where the coffee beans are would be placed on these racks, and the sun would dry them, right? So here in this image, we have the sun hitting these racks. And Salazar comes from a family of coffee growers, and was considering this this staple, right, of Puerto Rico, and what its implications could be for questions around food sovereignty, for questions around reestablishing a sort of connection to the land. And then in the context of the exhibition, which of course reflects on the past 5 years since Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico in 2017, they become also sort of attached to this idea of mourning, almost like they're the racks in a morgue. We can imagine bodies, and there's a sort of sense of mourning then that's attached to this agricultural, quite simple agricultural structure. Salazar names this piece, in fact, Reclamation and Place, Puerto Rico. And so she's directly asking this question of what it would mean to direct attention at something like coffee, right? To reestablish and to assert oneself as Puerto Ricans into that industry, right? And there are many small coffee companies who are doing this. And Salazar is thinking about this material. It's really charged, right? It's on those aerial view maps. It's a huge part of the histories of enslavement, of indentured labor in Puerto Rico, but also of agriculture in a broader sense. And so she's considering these materials. Here's a reference image that she used, where she's thinking about, what kinds of inventions, right? What kinds of structures come out of this relationship to the land and to a particular crop. And then we have these pave stones, which are stacked near the coffee drying racks. And these pave stones are made out of reclaimed coffee grounds, where Salazar creates a sort of special mixture so that she can create, so that she can produce these hexagonal, forms which can fit into one another, and that recall the stones that can pave a roadway or a plaza. However, coffee grounds break down. Many building materials do over time, but especially coffee grounds are quite vulnerable to external elements. And so as time has passed with this exhibition outside on the Whitney's deck, we have these really beautiful moments where the pave stones in one area are creating these strict geometries. They fit into each other almost like a honeycomb. And then in other areas, they crumble and they form puddles, or rain forms puddles in those shapes. And they kind of return to their original form, that is, as these wet grounds. So this idea of reuse and of ephemerality is at play here, where the idea of permanence is one that's quite difficult to grapple with, especially in the context of the Caribbean. where the climate itself means the breakdown of things more quickly. Humidity and salt in the air means that things have to be painted more often, that museums have to have even more things in place to control climate and moisture in the air, and that the roads, if you've driven through Puerto Rico, you know, the roads have more moisture, which expands cracks, which forms potholes, and with this, with corrupt government, right, and the lack of investment in local communities, those holes go unacknowledged, right? And so Salazar is thinking about this idea of ephemerality, of this human intervention in the landscape, which in this case is the kind of pavestone, the organizing of space. She asks sort of what would it mean to accept a kind of ephemerality, accept that these can be replaced over and over, that this can be a sort of ritual that brings people actually closer to the land. So I'll conclude with some new aerial views, perhaps even anti-colonial ones. These are three paintings, freestanding by Candida Alvarez, and they're two-sided, and they envision, or they serve as these kinds of visions that combine Alvarez's memories of these aerial views of Puerto Rico, which for those that travel back and forth between the US and Puerto Rico, this image of approaching the archipelago from the plane is repeated again and again. It becomes this another kind of repeated ritual where you're seeing something from above and then you're touching down to the land. And during or after Hurricane Maria, Alvarez, who is based in Chicago, was thinking about what happens when the land degrades, when things wash away. Would the plot of land that belonged to her grandparents look the same from above? Likely not, after the hurricane. And those images from above would change quite drastically. Roofs would be replaced by blue tarps. The clean lines of a field for crops would be blurred. And so Alvarez is here using abstraction to consider that blurring. And in some ways, these images also evoke the kinds of images we see or that we saw of Puerto Rico during the hurricane on the Weather Channel, for example, where a real place suddenly is shown to us as these little shapes on a screen that get enveloped by pixels of different colors. And so Alvarez here is sort of combining some of these abstractions and thinking about what they really mean for one's memory of the land and for the land itself. This is the other side of those paintings here. And then we have this other work in the show by Tirado Rivera. And this is from a series of sandcastles that he makes after famous resorts and hotels in Puerto Rico. The one in the exhibition is made after a hotel called La Concha in San Juan. And making a hotel out of sand has various levels of significance here for Tirado Rivera. First of all, it makes it quite fragile. The guards have to stand by this sandcastle all day just to make sure people aren't bumping into it. But to make something like architecture, which is so permanent, seem so fragile, actually does bring up a lot of those questions that Salazar is dealing with the coffee pavestones, and sort of asking the question of the beaches kind of reclaiming this space that has been allocated for tourism. After Hurricane Maria, the sort of propaganda and promotion of investment in Puerto Rico by outside investors and real estate developers increased. And the kinds of loopholes that were found and used by a lot of those developers have initiated rounds and rounds of protests in various parts of the archipelago. And one reason for this is that some of these new resorts that are being built way too close to the coastline. So disobeying laws around how close you can build, and therefore leading to coastal erosion. And the irony there is, of course, that these resorts and hotels and private residences that want to build so close to the beach want to do so because of this image of paradise, because they want to be close to what the tropics are supposed to look like. Yet in the process of building these vantage points for that and having the privilege to be as close as possible, they're actually destroying that very thing that they want to see so bad. Another work by Tirado Rivera, which is not in the show, is this neon sign here, which says Caribe hostile Caribbean. And this font here is borrowed from that of the Caribe Hilton, which opened in 1949, and where the pina colada was invented. It's this kind of mecca of what tourism has come to look like in Puerto Rico. And so Tirado Rivera, with this play on words and with this borrowing of the font, contrasts very directly that image of leisure, the kind of carefreeness that a place like the Hilton Hotel might advertise to U.S. tourists and tourists from elsewhere, contrasted with the hostile conditions of this coastal erosion, of houses that still don't have roofs, of rolling blackouts, of potholes, and the list goes on. So rather than simply a vacation destination or a map of potential properties, we must consider Puerto Rico and other Caribbean nations as islands and their people. Land cannot be separated from the body. And as Zelia Sanchez seems to communicate in her topographic canvases, an untitled one here, which she made over many years from 1956 to 1999, shows us this kind of relationship between the idea of topography, of the rises and falls in a landscape, and this kind of clumsy mapping of using lines to figure out where one is, where one will go, and also having this connection to the body in a sort of erotics. She calls her series erotic topologies, where the landscape cannot be separated from the body. When we see the aerial view with pixelated hurricanes on weather maps, with these 3D images of, and on the left we have an image of the Puerto Rico Trench. These aerial views, the Google Maps zoom out, right? Give us a sense that this is merely land, merely a piece of a map. We might see, the tops of houses. We might see the peaks of mountains. And in addition to the pixelated hurricane representation enveloping the archipelago, we might even see lights go dark. And this is an image right after Hurricane Maria, when the majority of Puerto Rico lost electricity. And this isn't something that feels so far in the past. Doesn't feel like it's only 2017 because of the continuing rolling blackouts in Puerto Rico. And so when we see the aerial view with lights gone dark, we must also see the people within that map. And as El Perez reminds us here in a film still showing their great aunt during a post-hurricane blackout, this map has to always include these moments, right, of the people who are attached to that land. And so I'll conclude there and encourage you to attend the second part of the course, where we'll look at more work from the Puerto Rican diaspora in the US, at some poetry, and specifically at protest posters and prints related to it. I'm going into the Q&A now. I have a question from Joseph Bothwell. Any idea whether this political art was influenced by Goya or Spanish protest art? I'm actually going to show you one of my slides that I didn't get to include. And this is another poster by Garvin Sierra Vega. And it's one of Goya's most famous paintings, Saturn devouring his children. But instead of his small child, which is in that painting, a small creature, we have Saturn devouring this map of Puerto Rico cut out from an image of what looks like a lawn or sort of grass trimmings. And I almost concluded on this image because I wanted to draw attention or bring us back to this idea of US paternalism, right? Saturn devours his children. And the US, especially in the 40s and 50s, used so much language around its territories as places that needed to be guided, as if the US was this benevolent father figure. But of course, as we see with this neglect of the people of Puerto Rico after the hurricane and in many stages throughout history, and this violence toward Puerto Ricans, especially those seeking sovereignty in many forms, right, that paternalism becomes quite deadly. Let's see. I have a question and a comment from Benino Trio. Can you comment on the various meanings of the word reclamation for the exhibit? Reclamation as a restoration, as a return of something, but also to procure from refuse, to call back, and even to tame, as in to reclaim a falcon. I think you answer your question in your phrasing of it. It's a beautiful and a difficult word, right? This idea of reclamation. The reclaiming of land is not an easy thing. It's not a neutral thing. It involves sort of a restructuring even of our understanding of what land is. Because of this history of colonial map making and aerial views, we come to see land as property. And as many Indigenous peoples will tell you, that is not necessarily true. Land cannot be owned. And so the question of reclamation there and taking land into one's own hands raises political as well as sort of philosophical questions. Let's see. Karen Wald here comments on the fact that art often seems to represent nostalgic views, which aren't going to directly improve the life of the people who live there, and asks if I have any comments. Nostalgia is quite an issue for the Caribbean and depictions of the Caribbean, right? Yet it's also a really important factor of keeping these connections between the people in Puerto Rico and in the diaspora. That figure of the Jibaro, for example, has been critiqued by a range of scholars for, for, like I said, being whitewashed, for becoming this kind of symbol of a time that's gone and no longer retrievable. However, if we really think about it and sort of disconnect the idea of when we see something that seems old or quaint or beautiful, right? If we sit and really think about why it looks that way, who decided to make it look that way, it raises all these questions that I think continue to be important to political organizing. So even the nostalgic things, things like songs, for example, keep us asking questions. Any more questions? Let's see. I have, in reference to Rogelio Baez Vega's Escuela Tomás Carrión Maduro Santurce, that was the painting of the abandoned school. Do you see a new wave of artwork depicting the similar attack on the public university system? It's interesting. I can't think of exact examples, but the question of education is a really big one, and I think also is connected to questions around grants and sort of what kinds of resources get allocated where. So in the cultural sector, for example, what museums get funding, what artists get funding, when and why do they? There was a wave of artist grants after Hurricane Maria, of course, and those came from the Mellon Foundation, from these big U.S. organizations. But do grants only follow disaster? And how can a sense of continuity, right, of generational investment over generations in the University of Puerto Rico system, how can that happen, right? And it's not. I don't think it can happen just by one period of lots of grants coming from the U.S., of course. Okay, any other questions? Sue Adams asks, does Puerto Rico have any indigenous people? If yes, do they have any art on display in the exhibition? That's a question I'm going to take up in the next part of the course. And yes, Puerto Rico does have indigenous people. And several works, especially a work by Javier Orfón in the exhibition, which I'll deal with, or not deal with, I'll work with, really thinks about naming, indigenous naming, and how this might continue to foster a connection to land and to sovereignty. And perhaps last question. Lissy asks, have the artists included in the show formed a community where they further develop the ideas they speak of in their art? A community that would specifically propose solutions to systemic issues that plague Puerto Rico and other colonized Caribbean countries? Definitely. The artists were already a community before they were included in this exhibition at the Whitney. The presence of this exhibition at the Whitney Museum of American Art itself is interesting to think about, is an interesting thing to think about with regards to the creation of community in Puerto Rico and in the diaspora, with connection to this this label of American art, and how to situate oneself with regards to that. To museums in New York making more of a concerted effort to include Latinx artists in their collections and to collect those artists and support them. And so the question of community, doesn't need institutions. Institutions sort of incubate them or foster them or host them for some time, but the community proceeded and continues beyond this exhibition for sure. Okay. I'm just doing one last scroll to see if there's any other questions. All right, that looks like it's it. I thank you all for your questions. Those are really great. I encourage you to attend the second part of the course, which will be titled Protest in Print, Memory and Matter. I thank you all and encourage you to come see the exhibition if you're new. Thank you.